Captain Sarah Mitchell had been flying commercial aircraft for 17 years. She had seen everything from engine failures to medical emergencies, but nothing could have prepared her for what would happen on Flight 447 from Dubai to London. The morning started like any other Tuesday morning. Sarah woke up at 4 in the morning in her hotel room, went through her pre-flight routine, and made her way to the airport. The sun was just beginning to rise over the Persian Gulf, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sarah was known among her colleagues as one of the calmest pilots in the airline. She never panicked, never raised her voice, and always maintained her composure, even in the most stressful situations. Her first officer, James Cooper, often joked that Sarah could probably land a plane while drinking tea and reading a newspaper. She had that kind of confidence that came from years of experience and thousands of hours in the cockpit. The flight that day was scheduled to depart at 7 in the morning. Sarah arrived at the airport 2 hours early, as she always did. She believed in being prepared, in checking every detail before takeoff. She met with James in the crew briefing room, where they went over the flight plan, weather conditions, and passenger manifest. Everything seemed normal. The weather was clear, the aircraft had passed all its maintenance checks, and the passenger load was average for a Tuesday morning flight. There were 243 passengers boarding Flight 447 that morning. Among them were business travelers heading back to London after meetings in Dubai, families returning from vacation, and a few tourists eager to explore England. Sarah always made it a point to walk through the cabin before takeoff, greeting passengers and making sure everyone was comfortable. It was something she had learned from her father, who had also been a pilot. He used to tell her that the people in the cabin were not just passengers. They were human beings who had trusted you with their lives. As Sarah walked through the economy section that morning, she noticed a young woman sitting in seat 23. The woman appeared to be in her mid-20s, with dark hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She wore a plain blue shirt and jeans, and she had a small backpack tucked under the seat in front of her. What caught Sarah's attention was not the woman's appearance, but her demeanor. While other passengers were busy settling in, checking their phones, or chatting with companions, this woman sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her eyes were focused straight ahead. There was something about her stillness that made Sarah pause for just a moment. Sarah continued her walk through the cabin, greeting passengers and answering questions. An elderly man in first class wanted to know if they would encounter any turbulence. A mother with 2 young children asked if the flight attendants could warm up a bottle for her baby. Sarah handled each query with patience and professionalism. When she returned to the cockpit, she mentioned the unusually still woman to James, but only in passing. It was just an observation, nothing more. The boarding process completed smoothly. The flight attendants went through their safety demonstrations while Sarah and James ran through their final checks. The engines powered up with their familiar roar, and Flight 447 began its taxi toward the runway. Sarah had made this flight dozens of times before. The route from Dubai to London took approximately 7 hours, and she knew every waypoint, every alternate airport, and every potential challenge along the way. They took off at 7:15, just 15 minutes behind schedule due to a minor delay in loading cargo. The aircraft climbed steadily through the morning sky, leaving the glittering cityscape of Dubai behind. Sarah loved this part of flying, the moment when the ground fell away and the plane entered its element. Up here, 35,000 feet above the earth, everything felt peaceful and ordered. The sun streamed through the cockpit windows, and the instruments hummed with their steady rhythms. About 45 minutes into the flight, when they had reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign had been turned off, Sarah decided to make her usual announcement to the passengers. She picked up the microphone and spoke in her calm, professional voice, welcoming everyone aboard and providing information about the flight time, weather conditions at their destination, and the in-flight services available. She always kept these announcements brief and informative, knowing that most passengers were not particularly interested in lengthy speeches. The first 2 hours of the flight passed without incident. The flight attendants served breakfast. Passengers watched movies on their personal screens or dozed in their seats, and the aircraft continued its steady progress westward. Sarah and James talked about their families, their plans for their layover in London, and the latest news in the aviation industry. It was the kind of easy conversation that came from working together for many years. Then, At exactly 9:37 in the morning, everything changed. Sarah heard a commotion coming from the cabin through the intercom system. At first, it sounded like raised voices, which was not entirely unusual. Sometimes passengers got into arguments over armrests or reclining seats, but within seconds, the voices turned into screams. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the control panel, her body tensing even before her mind fully processed what was happening. The lead flight attendant, Maria Santos, burst into the cockpit through the reinforced door. Her face was pale, and her hands were shaking. She spoke quickly, her words tumbling over each other. There were men in the cabin, 4 of them, and they had weapons. They had taken control of the aisles and were threatening passengers. Maria had managed to escape to the cockpit just before one of the men could reach her. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but her training kicked in immediately. She turned to James and told him to lock the cockpit door and send out a distress signal. Then she turned back to Maria and asked for more details. Maria explained that the 4 men had emerged from different parts of the cabin almost simultaneously. They appeared to be in their 30s, dressed in casual clothing that had allowed them to blend in with other passengers during boarding. Each man carried what looked like a knife or some kind of sharp instrument. They had quickly moved to control the aisles, shouting orders at passengers to remain seated and silent. One of them had announced that they were taking over the aircraft and that anyone who resisted would be hurt. Sarah's mind raced through her training and protocols. Hijacking scenarios were something every pilot studied extensively, but the reality of actually facing one was entirely different. Her hands remained steady on the controls as she processed the information. The aircraft was currently over the Arabian Sea, about 3 hours from their destination. She needed to keep the plane stable, maintain communication with air traffic control, and somehow protect the 243 people in the cabin below. James had already sent out the hijack code to air traffic control. Within minutes, they received confirmation that the message had been received and that authorities on the ground were being notified. Sarah knew that military jets might be scrambled to intercept them, that airports along their route would be put on alert, and that negotiations might be attempted. But all of that was happening far below and far away. Right now, in this moment, she was alone with this crisis. One of the hijackers began pounding on the cockpit door. He shouted that the pilots needed to open the door immediately, or passengers would be harmed. Sarah looked at the reinforced door, which had been installed on all commercial aircraft after previous hijacking incidents. The door was designed to withstand significant force, but she knew that determined attackers might find ways to breach it. She ignored the pounding and focused on flying the aircraft. Then Sarah remembered the woman from seat 23, the one who had been sitting so still during boarding. Through the camera system that allowed pilots to view the cabin, Sarah switched through different angles, trying to assess the situation. The images were chaotic. Passengers were hunched in their seats, some with their hands over their heads, others crying or frozen in fear. The hijackers were spread throughout the cabin, brandishing their weapons and shouting orders. But then, Sarah spotted something that made her pause. The woman from seat 23 had not moved. While everyone around her was in various states of panic, she remained in her seat with that same unnatural stillness. Her hands were still folded in her lap, and her eyes were focused forward. But now, Sarah could see something different in the woman's posture. It was not the stillness of fear or shock. It was the stillness of someone waiting, calculating, preparing. Sarah watched through the camera as one of the hijackers moved down the aisle toward the back of the plane. He passed directly by the woman's seat, close enough that he could have touched her. But he did not seem to notice her. It was as if she had made herself invisible through sheer force of will. Sarah felt a strange certainty growing in her chest. This woman was not an ordinary passenger. She was something else entirely. The pounding on the cockpit door continued. The lead hijacker was now threatening to hurt a child if the pilots did not comply with his demands. Sarah could hear a child crying in the background, and the sound tore at her heart. But she knew that opening the cockpit door would likely result in the deaths of everyone on board. She had to trust that there was another way, that somehow this situation could be resolved without her surrendering control of the aircraft. James was on the radio with air traffic control, providing updates on their situation. Military authorities were requesting information about the hijackers' demands, but so far, The men had not communicated any specific requests. They seemed focused simply on creating fear and chaos. Sarah wondered what their endgame was. Were they planning to crash the plane, redirect it to another location, use it as a bargaining chip for some political demand? As these thoughts raced through her mind, Sarah kept watching the woman on the camera. The woman's eyes moved slowly, taking in every detail of the cabin. She was observing the hijackers, tracking their movements, noting their patterns. Sarah realized that the woman was doing exactly what Sarah herself would do if she were in that situation, gathering intelligence, waiting for the right moment to act. Then, almost imperceptibly, the woman moved. It was just a slight shift in her posture, a subtle repositioning of her weight. But Sarah, watching intently, recognized it for what it was. The woman was preparing to do something. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She wanted to warn the woman somehow, to tell her to stay safe, to wait for help. But there was no way to communicate with the cabin without alerting the hijackers. The lead hijacker moved back toward the front of the cabin. He was shouting now, his voice growing more agitated. He demanded that the pilots open the door within the next 60 seconds, or he would begin executing passengers. Sarah glanced at the clock on the instrument panel. She had less than a minute to make a decision that could determine whether hundreds of people lived or died. Sarah took a deep breath and made her choice. She would not open the door. She would trust in her training, in the reinforced barriers that protected the cockpit, and in the authorities who were surely working on a solution. But more than that, she would trust in the mysterious woman in seat 23, who sat so still while the world around her descended into chaos. There was something about that woman that gave Sarah hope, a sense that not everything was lost, that perhaps there was still a chance for these passengers to make it home safely. The 60 seconds counted down. 59, 58, 57. Sarah's hands remained steady on the controls. James looked at her, his eyes asking the question he could not speak aloud. Sarah nodded slightly. They would hold their position. They would not surrender the cockpit. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The timer reached 0, and Sarah heard a scream from the cabin. Her heart clenched, but she forced herself to remain focused. She could not afford to let emotion cloud her judgment. She had to think clearly, to fly the aircraft, to keep everyone alive for as long as possible. Help was coming. She had to believe that help was coming. Through the cabin camera, Sarah watched as the situation below grew more desperate with each passing moment. The hijacker who had threatened to harm passengers was now dragging a middle-aged businessman out of his seat. The man was pleading, his voice breaking with terror as he was forced into the aisle. Other passengers looked away, unable to watch what might happen next. Children buried their faces in their parents' arms. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from panic into something darker, a collective despair that seemed to drain the air of hope. But the woman in seat 23 remained motionless. Sarah kept one part of her attention on flying the aircraft, while another part stayed fixed on that camera feed. She noticed now that the woman's eyes were tracking every movement the hijackers made. The woman was counting something, perhaps timing the intervals between when the men moved through the cabin or calculating the distance between them. Whatever she was doing, it was methodical and precise. The lead hijacker yanked the businessman to his knees in the center aisle. He held a blade to the man's throat while shouting toward the cockpit. His demands were becoming clearer now. He wanted the pilots to divert the aircraft to a location he would specify. He wanted control of the plane's communication systems. He wanted the world to hear his message, whatever that message might be. Sarah knew she could not comply with any of these demands. The moment she gave these men access to the cockpit or control over the aircraft's systems, the situation would escalate beyond any possibility of a peaceful resolution. James was communicating with military authorities who were coordinating a response. Fighter jets had been dispatched and would intercept their position within 20 minutes. But 20 minutes felt like an eternity when someone was holding a knife to a passenger's throat. Sarah's training told her to remain calm, to follow protocol, to trust the system. But her heart was screaming at her to do something, anything, to save the terrified man kneeling in the aisle below. The woman in seat 23 shifted again. This time, the movement was more pronounced. She unbuckled her seatbelt with slow, deliberate motions that would not attract attention. Sarah realized she was holding her breath as she watched. The woman was going to act. Sarah did not know who this woman was or what she planned to do, but every instinct told her that something significant was about to happen. One of the other hijackers, a younger man stationed near the rear of the aircraft, turned his back to check on passengers in the last few rows. It was a small mistake, a momentary lapse in attention, but the woman noticed it immediately. Sarah saw the woman's body language change in an instant, transforming from stillness into coiled readiness. The woman rose from her seat in one fluid motion, moving with a speed and grace that seemed almost impossible. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Sarah almost missed it despite watching intently. The woman covered the distance between her seat and the nearest hijacker in seconds. Her movements were precise and efficient, like someone who had trained for years in close combat. She struck the hijacker in a specific point on his neck, and he crumpled to the floor without making a sound. The entire interaction took less than 5 seconds. The other passengers nearby stared in shock. Some of them had not even realized what happened until the hijacker was already on the ground. The woman did not pause to celebrate or explain. She immediately grabbed the fallen man's weapon and assessed the positions of the other 3 hijackers. Her eyes were cold and focused now, all pretense of being an ordinary passenger completely abandoned. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline course through her body. She understood now that this woman was some kind of trained operative, perhaps military or intelligence. The woman's actions had given them a chance, but the situation was still incredibly dangerous. The other 3 hijackers would realize within moments that something had gone wrong, and their response would likely be violent. The lead hijacker was still focused on the cockpit door and the businessman kneeling before him. He had not yet noticed the commotion in the back of the cabin, but the other 2 hijackers, positioned in the middle sections, were beginning to turn around, alerted by the sudden silence from their companion. The woman moved again before they could fully process what they were seeing. She ran down the aisle toward the middle of the cabin, staying low and using the seats as cover. Her movements reminded Sarah of footage she had seen of Special Forces operations, that same combination of speed and tactical awareness. The woman reached the second hijacker before he could raise his weapon. She executed another precise strike, this one targeting the man's solar plexus. He doubled over in pain, and she followed up with a blow to his temple that sent him sprawling across the laps of 2 stunned passengers. Now the lead hijacker realized something was wrong. He heard the commotion behind him and started to turn, dragging the businessman with him as a shield. His eyes went wide when he saw the woman advancing toward him. He shouted something in a language Sarah did not recognize and pressed his blade harder against the businessman's throat. A thin line of blood appeared where the sharp edge contacted skin. The woman stopped immediately. She stood in the aisle about 15 feet away from the hijacker, her body completely still once again. She held the weapon she had taken from the first hijacker loosely at her side, pointed at the floor. For several seconds, nobody moved. The entire cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Sarah could see the calculation happening behind the woman's eyes as she assessed this new configuration of the standoff. The remaining hijacker, the 4th man, was moving toward the front from his position near the rear galley. He had realized his companions were down and was rushing to support his leader. The woman's eyes flicked to him briefly, tracking his approach, but she kept her primary attention on the man holding the businessman hostage. Sarah could see the terrible math of the situation. The woman could not take down the lead hijacker without risking the businessman's life, but if she turned to deal with the 4th hijacker, the lead hijacker might kill his hostage anyway. Then the woman did something unexpected. She dropped her weapon. It clattered to the floor of the aisle, spinning slightly before coming to rest against a seat leg. The lead hijacker looked confused by this gesture. He shouted at her, demanding to know who she was and what organization she represented. The woman did not answer. She simply stood there with her hands slightly raised in a gesture that was not quite surrender but not quite aggression either. The 4th hijacker reached the front of the cabin and took position behind his leader. He shouted something triumphant, believing they had regained control of the situation. The lead hijacker began backing toward the cockpit door, still holding the businessman. He called out to Sarah, telling her that he now had 2 hostages and that she needed to open the door immediately, or both men would die. Sarah's mind raced through scenarios. She could not open the door, not even to save the hostages. Opening the door would give the hijackers access to the aircraft's controls, and that would endanger everyone aboard. But watching the blade press against the businessman's throat, seeing the terror in his eyes, felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for as a pilot. Her job was to protect these people, and right now, she felt powerless to do so. The woman in the aisle took a small step forward. The movement was subtle, almost conversational in its casualness. The lead hijacker tensed, pressing the blade harder against his hostage. Another thin line of blood traced down the businessman's neck. The woman stopped and spoke for the first time since the crisis began. Her voice was calm and steady, with an accent Sarah could not quite place. She told the hijacker that he was going to die today. She said it without emotion or threat, simply as a statement of fact. The hijacker laughed, a harsh sound that held no real humor. He asked her how she could be so certain when he was the one holding all the weapons. The woman's expression did not change. She told him that he had made 3 critical mistakes, and that these mistakes had sealed his fate. The hijacker demanded to know what mistakes she was talking about. The woman began listing them in that same calm, steady voice. First, she said they had failed to properly scout the passenger manifest. If they had done their research, they would have known that she was on this flight. Second, they had spread themselves too thin in the cabin, making it impossible to maintain proper coverage of all the passengers. And third, they had underestimated the determination of the pilots, who would never open that cockpit door, no matter what threats were made. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she listened through the intercom. This woman knew Sarah would not open the door. She had counted on it, had built her entire strategy around the certainty that the cockpit would remain secure. Sarah realized she was witnessing someone who thought several moves ahead, who could read a chaotic situation and find the pattern within it. The lead hijacker was becoming agitated. He shouted at the woman, calling her a liar and a fool. But Sarah could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes. He was beginning to doubt his control of the situation. The woman took another small step forward. This time, the hijacker did not press the blade harder. Instead, he loosened his grip slightly, his attention fully focused on this strange passenger who showed no fear. That momentary distraction was what the woman had been waiting for. In the split second when the hijacker's concentration wavered, she exploded into motion. She covered the distance between them faster than Sarah could track with her eyes. Her hand shot out and grabbed the wrist holding the knife, twisting it away from the businessman's throat with practiced efficiency. Her other hand struck the hijacker in the throat, a precise blow that made him gag and stumble backward. The businessman dropped to the floor and scrambled away on his hands and knees. The fourth hijacker lunged forward to help his leader, but he was too slow. The woman had already disarmed the lead hijacker and was using his own momentum against him. She pivoted smoothly, throwing the lead hijacker into his companion. Both men crashed into the rows of seats with enough force to shake the entire section of the cabin. What followed was a flurry of controlled violence that lasted perhaps 30 seconds but felt much longer. The woman moved between the 2 remaining hijackers with brutal efficiency. Every strike she delivered was purposeful and precise, targeting vulnerable points that would incapacitate without killing. Within those 30 seconds, both men were on the ground, conscious but unable to continue fighting. The woman secured them using zip ties that she produced from somewhere, binding their hands and feet with quick, practiced motions. When it was over, the woman stood in the aisle, breathing slightly harder than before, but otherwise appearing completely composed. She looked around at the passengers, many of whom were staring at her with expressions of shock and awe. Then she did something that surprised Sarah even more than the combat display she had just witnessed. She smiled, a warm and genuine smile that transformed her entire face, and told the passengers in a gentle voice that everything was going to be fine now. The cabin erupted in a chaos of relief. Passengers were crying, hugging each other, and some were even clapping. The woman moved through the cabin, checking on people, asking if anyone was injured, offering comfort to those who were most shaken. She helped the businessman to his feet and examined the cuts on his neck, determining they were superficial and would not require immediate medical attention. She spoke to a mother whose children had witnessed the violence, kneeling down to their level and explaining in simple terms that the bad men had been stopped and could not hurt anyone anymore. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. She had not realized she was crying until James reached over and squeezed her shoulder. They had just witnessed something extraordinary. This unknown woman had single-handedly neutralized a hijacking attempt that could have ended in tragedy. Sarah picked up the intercom and made an announcement to the cabin. She told the passengers that they were safe, that the situation was under control, and that they would be continuing to London, where emergency services would be waiting to meet them. The woman came to the cockpit door and knocked gently. Sarah opened it, something she would never normally do during a flight, but these were far from normal circumstances. The woman stepped inside, and Sarah got her first close look at their mysterious savior. Up close, Sarah could see that the woman's eyes were incredibly expressive, despite her generally calm demeanor. They held intelligence, experience, and something else that Sarah could not quite name. Perhaps it was sadness, or loneliness, or the weight of carrying secrets that could never be shared. The woman identified herself simply as Agent Rachel Morrison. She showed Sarah credentials that indicated she worked for an international counterterrorism organization. She explained that she had been tracking this particular cell of terrorists for months and had received intelligence that they might attempt an operation on this route. She had booked a seat on the flight specifically to intercept them if they made their move. Sarah listened as Agent Morrison explained the broader context of what had just happened. The 4 hijackers were part of a larger terrorist network that had been planning multiple simultaneous attacks on commercial flights. Rachel's organization had been working to infiltrate the network for over a year, gathering intelligence and trying to prevent the attacks before they could be executed. When they received credible intelligence that this particular flight was a target, Rachel had volunteered to be on board as a safeguard. The agent spoke with quiet professionalism, but Sarah could hear the strain underneath her calm exterior. Rachel had just engaged in life-or-death combat at 35,000 feet. She had put herself between passengers and armed terrorists, knowing that any mistake could result in catastrophe. Yet here she was, speaking as if she had just completed a routine assignment. Sarah felt profound respect for this woman who carried such enormous responsibility with such grace. James was already coordinating with air traffic control to update them on the situation. Military jets had reached their position and were escorting the aircraft, but the immediate crisis was over. The fighter pilots reported seeing no unusual activity through their visual observation of Flight 447. Sarah informed them that the threat had been neutralized by an agent on board and that they would continue to London as planned. The response from ground control was a mixture of relief and disbelief. Back in the cabin, flight attendants were working to restore some sense of normalcy. They had moved the restrained hijackers to the rear galley where they could be monitored. Several passengers who were doctors or nurses had volunteered to check on anyone who might need medical attention. Miraculously, aside from the businessman's minor cuts and some bruises sustained by passengers who had been pushed or grabbed during the initial takeover, everyone was physically unharmed. The psychological impact would take much longer to heal, but at least everyone was alive. Rachel returned to the cabin to help calm passengers and gather evidence from the scene. Sarah watched her through the camera feed, marveling at how the agent seamlessly transitioned from warrior to caretaker. She was answering questions from frightened passengers, holding the hands of crying children, and carefully documenting the weapons and materials the hijackers had brought aboard. Every action was purposeful and considerate of the trauma people had just experienced. An elderly woman approached Rachel and embraced her tightly. The woman was crying and thanking Rachel repeatedly for saving her life. Rachel hugged her back, and for just a moment, Sarah saw the agent's professional mask slip. There was deep emotion in her eyes, perhaps a recognition of the profound responsibility that came with protecting innocent lives. Then the mask was back in place, and Rachel was gently guiding the woman back to her seat and ensuring she was comfortable. Sarah faced her own responsibilities now. She needed to fly this aircraft safely to London while managing the aftermath of an attempted hijacking. She coordinated with British authorities who were preparing to receive the flight. Special security teams would board immediately upon landing to take custody of the hijackers. Counselors and medical personnel would be available for passengers who needed support. The airport was being partially locked down to ensure no other members of the terrorist cell could escape or retaliate. The remaining hours of the flight passed in a strange atmosphere of exhausted relief. Some passengers tried to return to their normal activities, watching movies or reading books, though Sarah suspected few could actually focus. Others sat quietly, processing what they had witnessed. Small groups formed in the aisles as people shared their experiences and supported each other. The flight attendants moved through the cabin offering water, snacks, and reassurance. It was like watching a community form in real time, bonded by shared trauma and survival. Rachel spent much of this time speaking individually with passengers, taking statements and gathering information that might be useful for the broader investigation. Sarah learned through the intercom that Rachel was particularly interested in anything unusual passengers had noticed before the hijacking began. Had any of the four men been communicating with each other? Had anyone seen them acting suspiciously? Every detail might help prevent future attacks. A teenage boy approached Rachel shyly, holding his phone. He explained that he had been recording video for his social media when the hijacking started, and that he had captured some of the incident on film. Rachel asked him gently if she could see the footage. As they watched together, Sarah could see through the cabin camera that the video showed the initial moments of the takeover, including clear images of all four hijackers' faces. Rachel praised the boy for his presence of mind and asked if he would be willing to share the footage with authorities. The boy agreed eagerly, proud to contribute something meaningful. Sarah reflected on how much had changed in the hours since takeoff. She had begun this flight thinking it would be another routine trip, another 7 hours of professional but unremarkable work. Instead, she had found herself in command during a terrorist attack, forced to make impossible decisions while trusting in a woman she had never met. She thought about the moment she had refused to open the cockpit door despite the threats, knowing that her decision might result in someone's death. She thought about how close they had all come to a much darker outcome. James caught her eye and gave her a small, understanding nod. He knew what she was thinking, because he was thinking the same things. They had trained for scenarios like this, had practiced the protocols countless times in simulators, but the training could never fully prepare you for the reality of hearing genuine terror in people's voices, of watching through a camera as violence unfolded in your cabin, of feeling the weight of responsibility for hundreds of lives pressing down on your shoulders. They had both aged years in the space of a few hours. As they began their descent toward London, Sarah made another announcement to the passengers. She told them how proud she was of their courage and resilience during the crisis. She acknowledged the fear they had experienced and validated that it was completely normal to feel shaken and traumatized by what had happened. She informed them about the support services that would be available upon landing and encouraged everyone to take advantage of those resources. And she thanked them for their trust in her crew and in the aircraft. When Sarah finished speaking, spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin. The passengers were clapping for her, for James, for the flight attendants who had maintained their professionalism throughout the ordeal, and especially for Rachel, who had risked her life to save theirs. Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. This was why she had become a pilot, not for the glamour or adventure, but for moments like this when her skills and decisions directly protected human lives. The landing at London Heathrow was smooth despite Sarah's exhaustion. As the wheels touched down on British soil, another round of applause erupted from the cabin. Sarah taxied the aircraft to a remote stand where armed security personnel were waiting. She could see emergency vehicles, police cars, and unmarked vehicles that probably contained intelligence officials. The entire area had been cordoned off to contain the situation. Once the engines were shut down, the process of evacuating passengers began under careful security supervision. Armed officers boarded the aircraft first and took custody of the four hijackers, who were removed in handcuffs and surrounded by heavily armed escorts. Rachel coordinated with the security team, providing briefings and handing over the evidence she had collected. Her transformation from passenger to professional agent was now complete, and Sarah could see the respect in the eyes of the officers who worked with her. Passengers disembarked slowly, many still shaky from their experience. Counselors waited at the gate to provide immediate psychological support. Medical teams checked anyone who requested evaluation. Sarah, James, and the flight attendants were among the last to leave the aircraft. As Sarah walked through the empty cabin one final time, she noticed a jacket left behind on seat 23, Rachel's seat. She picked it up, intending to return it to the agent. In the terminal, Sarah found herself immediately surrounded by officials wanting statements and reports. She answered their questions patiently, providing detailed accounts of everything she had observed from the cockpit. James was similarly occupied with another group of officials. The airline's management team arrived to support their crew and begin their own internal investigation. The media had gotten word of the incident, and reporters were gathering outside the secure area, eager for any information about the dramatic events. Through all the chaos, Sarah kept looking for Rachel. She finally spotted the agent in a corner of the secure area, speaking intently with several men in dark suits who were clearly senior intelligence officials. Sarah waited for an appropriate moment and then approached with the forgotten jacket. Rachel looked up and smiled when she saw Sarah coming. She thanked her for retrieving the jacket and then stepped away from her colleagues for a brief private conversation. Sarah found herself struggling to express what she wanted to say. How do you thank someone for saving hundreds of lives? How do you acknowledge the extraordinary courage it takes to stand alone against armed terrorists? Rachel seemed to understand her difficulty and spoke first. She told Sarah that her decision not to open the cockpit door, despite the threats and pressure, had been absolutely correct and had given Rachel the time she needed to act. She said that Sarah's steady command during the crisis had been inspirational and had helped keep everyone as calm as possible under the circumstances. The two women talked for several minutes, forming a connection born from shared crisis. Rachel revealed a bit more about her work, explaining that she often operated in shadows, taking actions that would never be publicly acknowledged. She said that most people would never know how many attacks had been prevented, how many lives had been saved by agents working behind the scenes. She spoke about the loneliness of that work, the burden of carrying secrets, and the satisfaction of knowing you had made a real difference, even if nobody else knew about it. Sarah asked Rachel if she was afraid during the confrontation with the hijackers. Rachel was quiet for a moment before answering. She admitted that she felt fear every time she went into action, but that fear was just information, a signal from her body that she needed to be alert and careful. She said that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. She told Sarah that every pilot who climbed into a cockpit demonstrated that same courage, taking responsibility for lives and accepting the weight that came with that responsibility. Before they parted, Rachel gave Sarah her contact information. She said that if Sarah ever needed to talk about what had happened, or if she simply wanted to connect with someone who understood the unique pressures of their respective professions, Rachel would be available. Sarah accepted the card gratefully, sensing that this was not something Rachel offered casually. They embraced briefly, two women who had faced danger together and emerged changed by the experience. In the days that followed, the incident on Flight 447 dominated international news. The story captured public imagination, this dramatic tale of a secret agent thwarting a terrorist attack aboard a commercial flight. Rachel's identity was initially kept classified, referred to only as an unnamed security official. But eventually, some details were released to the public. She became something of a hero. Though Sarah knew from their conversation that Rachel was uncomfortable with the attention, Sarah herself became part of the story. Passengers praised her steady leadership during the crisis, and aviation experts commended her decision to maintain cockpit security despite the threats. The airline held a ceremony honoring Sarah, James, and their entire crew for their professionalism under extreme pressure. Sarah accepted the recognition gracefully, but felt slightly uncomfortable with the spotlight. She had simply done her job, made the decisions her training had prepared her to make. Several passengers from Flight 447 reached out to Sarah in the weeks after the incident. They sent letters and emails thanking her for bringing them home safely, sharing how the experience had changed their perspectives on life. The businessman who had been held hostage wrote a particularly moving letter describing how Sarah's voice over the intercom, calm and steady even in the worst moments, had given him hope that he might survive. Reading these messages, Sarah felt the full weight of what they had all been through together. The 4 hijackers were prosecuted and received lengthy prison sentences. The investigation revealed that they were indeed part of a larger network planning coordinated attacks, just as Rachel had indicated. Rachel's intervention on Flight 447, combined with the intelligence she gathered during and after the incident, led to the disruption of several other planned attacks. Lives were saved not just on that one flight, but on others that never became targets because the network was dismantled. Sarah returned to flying after a few weeks of mandatory leave and counseling. She found herself changed by the experience, in ways both subtle and profound. She paid closer attention to passengers during boarding, though she tried not to let the incident make her paranoid or suspicious. She felt more deeply connected to the responsibility of her role, more aware of the trust people placed in her every time they boarded her aircraft. And she felt gratitude for ordinary, uneventful flights, for the hundreds of times when nothing went wrong and everyone arrived safely at their destination. She and Rachel stayed in touch, meeting occasionally when their schedules allowed. They would have coffee and talk about their lives, their work, and the ways they each coped with the pressures of their professions. Sarah found these conversations valuable. This connection with someone who understood what it meant to make life or death decisions as part of your job. They never talked much about the hijacking itself. That experience was something they both carried but did not need to constantly revisit. A year after the incident, the airline invited Sarah to speak at a safety training seminar for pilots and crew members. She shared her experience from Flight 447, walking through the decisions she had made and the reasoning behind them. She emphasized the importance of following protocols, even when every instinct screamed at you to do something different. She talked about the value of staying calm, of trusting your training, and of recognizing that you are part of a larger system designed to handle crisis situations. During the question period after her presentation, a young pilot asked how Sarah had found the strength to refuse the hijackers' demands when they threatened to kill passengers. Sarah thought carefully before answering. She explained that it was not about strength in the traditional sense, but about understanding the broader implications of each choice. Opening the cockpit door would have put everyone at risk, not just the immediate hostages. Her job was to protect all the passengers, even if that meant making a terrible choice that might cost some of them their lives. She said that living with that kind of decision was one of the hardest aspects of being in command. Sarah also spoke about Rachel, though she used only her first name and did not reveal specifics about her work. She described how one passenger's extraordinary actions had turned a catastrophic situation into a survivable one. She talked about the importance of remembering that the people in your cabin are not just passengers but individuals with their own stories, skills, and strengths. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places, and a good leader recognizes and trusts that help when it appears. As time passed, Flight 447 faded from headlines and became just another entry in the long history of aviation incidents. But for Sarah and the 243 people who had been aboard that day, it remained a defining experience. They had faced terror together and had survived because of courage, training, and one remarkable woman who had stayed steady while chaos erupted around her. Sarah often thought about that moment when she had first noticed Rachel sitting so still in seat 23. Something had told her then that this woman was different, though she could never have imagined how different. She thought about how many times Rachel had probably done similar things, sitting unnoticed on flights or in airports or public spaces, watching for threats that most people never knew existed. She felt grateful for people like Rachel, who dedicated their lives to protecting others, who accepted danger as part of their daily work. And Sarah felt grateful for her own calling, for the opportunity to fly, to command, to take responsibility for lives. The incident had not broken her or made her afraid to fly. Instead, it had deepened her commitment to her profession and her appreciation for every safe landing, every routine flight, every moment when the miracle of flight proceeded without drama or crisis. Years later, Sarah would still sometimes wake from dreams of that day. She would remember the pounding on the cockpit door, the screams from the cabin, the terrible weight of having to decide whether to act or wait. But she would also remember Rachel's stillness, her precision, her courage. And Sarah would remember her own steady hands on the controls, her calm voice over the intercom, her determination to bring everyone home safely. Those memories, both difficult and inspiring, had become part of who she was as a pilot and as a person. The final lesson Sarah took from Flight 447 was this: in moments of crisis, what matters most is not the absence of fear, but the presence of purpose. Rachel had purpose when she stood between passengers and terrorists. Sarah had purpose when she refused to surrender the cockpit. Every person who had stayed calm, who had helped others, who had done their small part to survive that day, had demonstrated purpose. And that purpose, multiplied across hundreds of lives, had been enough to overcome terror and bring them all safely home.